Welcome to World Builder's Anvil, episode 289. World building differences, novels versus RPG settings. Don't know where to start building your fantasy world?
Do you need more? Does it make sense?
Forget any worries and become a crafter of imagination.
This is the place where we will prime your mind.
Now, it's time to heat up the forge.
Break out the mithril ingots and hammer.
Welcome to the World Builder's Anvil. I'm Jeffrey W. Ingram.
And I'm Michael Miller.
Let's sup from the muck of Java and build. Welcome back. As always, sanding my belt. My name is Jeffrey W. Ingram.
And my belt is made of sand, which doesn't hold my pants up very well. I am Michael Miller.
Very good. Okay. Welcome to the episode, everyone. We're going to talk about big, broad stroke kind of stuff for world building today. It's a construction thing. And one of the things I notice is, people always talk about doing world building, but they never distinguish, is it for an RPG game? Is it for a novel? I'm just trying to work up a setting. And, the thing I want people to come away with in this episode is that depending on your project, and it's not just limited to these two things, but these are the ones we generally talk about, whether you're building a game, whatever you're doing where you're world building, you're going to have different needs up front and then as you continue. And so following, building out a complete world, you'll never finish. So the thing is, let's just start thinking about what am I using my world building for, and what are some things I need to keep in mind.
I like it. Give me a second here. I gotta pull this up. I forgot to reorganize my screen, but now my screen is reorganized, and I'm ready to dispute your every point.
Very good. Well, we're to a normal episode then.
Now, a lot of what you're starting off with here sounds like framework. Do you want to mention any framework stuff, or you want to hold off on that?
Well, in general, this is sort of, why frameworks are important.
Okay.
Instead of building out a complete world. So, but it's talking about it from a little bit different perspective.
Okay. Like what?
Like novels versus RPG settings, what are some of the differences? So when you're building an RPG setting, you kind of know what to focus on early. If you're building a novel, you know what to focus on as well too. So, the idea is, whenever, and we've talked about this before in prior episodes, is always think about the project you're trying to do and what you're trying to achieve. And the good thing is, depending on how you're trying to deliver it, you can focus in slightly differently to what you need to develop before you go. So now,
sorry, I lost my place. Are you at three important needs?
Yeah, sure. Let's go to three important needs.
All right. So three important needs for a novel setting. And number one, you have here details needed for the narrative.
Mm-hmm. And that's the thing is, before you start writing a novel or any story, you kind of need to know what the plot's going to be.
Tends to help.
Who the characters are in general, but, have a pretty good idea of who the important characters are.
All of this you should be able to put together in an outline.
Exactly. Just a quick outline, bullet pointed, maybe a sentence or two. Sometimes bullets aren't quite enough to remember.
Or lists of locations.
List of locations, and I always like to think about things, chapters as scenes, and there maybe is multiple scenes in a chapter, if it's a bigger chapter. But in general, I usually kind of like to think of chapters as a scene. That way, where does the scene take place? Does it take place in multiple settings? Like the scene is I'm traveling from here to there, or is it just located in the bar, in the corner table of a tavern? which many scenes happen in things at corner table of a tavern.
There are convenient locations to have conversations about the seedy underworkings of what we plan to do this evening.
That's right. I just found a new cave outside of town. We lived here for 42 years, and now we just found a cave. And there's goblins that live there. Wait, I'm getting RPG settings now, or not necessarily. But the idea is, once you start creating your outline for your novel, that will tell you specifically what you need to develop. Now, I do think it's important, if you want a world to feel like it's bigger than the few things that you throw in there, that you develop bits around there so it sort of meshes together and it all feels cohesive to you as a writer. You don't need to know everything. If you don't visit any temples, you might know that there's a religion, and you might know only a fact or two about the religion that comes up in the story, but you don't need to fully develop out a religion.
You can also allude to things just by mentioning in passing, like, oh, this is Obi-Wan Kenobi. He was friends with my father during the Clone Wars. Yeah. And that tells you a wealth of things with just two simple throwaway sentences that now you could it was just part of an introduction, but now this guy and this guy's father go way back. We know that there was a war. We know that clones are possible in this world. Like a lot is said by just having those two sentences. It already fills in some background, things that the reader or viewer can imagine before they ever get told.
And here's the thing is, you might know that the father and Obi-Wan have a falling out. You don't release it at that point, but you don't need all of the details of the Clone War. You just need to know that, because it's important to the story, in this case of Star Wars, the Empire won the Clone War, the Jedi lost. And the two characters deviate at that point, even though it's not alluded to when you introduce it. You really don't need to know much more. And I seriously doubt that that there were a lot of details. The broad strokes of it might have been understood, that this is where the Emperor seized power from the Republic and defeated the Jedi. But you don't need to know a lot about that if you're writing the Star Wars story. The specific A New Hope, when I say that.
And that is that leads us into details needed for the narrative. And again, these are for novels, not for the RPG.
Because it's different in a novel. You have complete control over a narrative, unlike what a lot of people say, where they're controlled by a narrative. If you're controlled by your narrative, you don't know your story well enough, and you need to spend time thinking more about it. But in general, you might need side scenes sometimes to add in to get a character back on track, or to stop them from their progression because it's progressing too quickly. But in general, you control the narrative.
Stop progressing.
So the thing is, the further you get away from where the story is, let's say it takes place in one city, you might know that city is part of a government. You might know a few basic details of the government. You might know a few important people who would be known regionally, and you just have a few facts, even if they don't necessarily show up in the story, just so they might end up as part of dialogue or something to add some richness to the world. You really need to know very little about anything outside of those narrative settings or the character backgrounds. And even that, when you go back, the further you get away from the story, the less relevant is the story, the less you need to know. So, when I'm writing a book, I like to think, what are the elements I need, the locations, the characters, those two specifically, but it could also go into important props, for Star Wars, a lightsaber or the Millennium Falcon. You flesh out the things that are going to be in the story, but you don't have to, you just want some vague knowledge of what's around there. You just need enough to where it feels like the story is taking place in the world. And in general, you really only need enough to start. by having what characters are in the first chapter, start with them, and what is the location. Flesh those out, and then start working through your chapter outline to sit there and make sure you have all your locations, all your props, all of your characters worked out to the level they need to be. Obviously, supporting characters and main characters you're going to know a lot more about than your one-off characters. You're not necessarily going to know a lot about them, but if something comes to mind when you're developing it, write it down. Sometimes it'll allow you to maybe take the dialogue to the same spot, but in a little bit different direction than you would if you didn't know. For example, the town guard you need to get past has a gambling problem, and so you buy his marker out so you can get past him. Something like that, So you might know a one-off detail occasionally. If something occurs to you as you're going through your chapter outline, flesh it out just a little bit, but don't waste too much time on your one-off characters. If the guard's only going to show up in that one scene, leave him there. And later on, if somehow you decide to bring him back, you can flesh him out more from the information you know. I usually like to have a document that goes along with the book to where you can help keep track of the characters, and as they get more fleshed out, or as the locations get more fleshed out, due to narrative needs that you either didn't see when you're developing your outline, or just you get a clever idea you want to play through, you can add to that one document, and you can always have the one reference place to go back to. And then it's like for history and stuff like that, you need to know the recent history of the area you're in, and think of a quick timeline going back, and it depends a lot on the people and the importance of history, but what are the things that are remembered? You don't need to know the formation of the kingdom 2,000 years ago if it's not relevant to the story. Now, if it's in your brain and you want to get it out, it's okay, but you don't need to flesh out the background timelines as much. You just need to know enough about what's creating the current conditions that's going to create the challenge that is going to be overcome in your story. You don't essentially need Middle Earth to write a novel.
I agree.
And the thing is, if you end up with more books, you can always elaborate more, and always keep in mind that one person's perspective, they're not necessarily, they're not omniscient. They can be wrong. And
you're referring about like the narrative perspective, like whatever character you're following.
Whatever character's revealing information. Let's say you have, another fantasy race that isn't really in the book, but they get talked about for a bit. And then later on, you decide to write another book and you include them in there and they're different. It's okay. You need to take some time to probably explain that to readers of why that person was flawed, either through dialogue or through, something else. Hey, you British have a bad, just don't understand the French well enough to really explain us. So let us share who we really are. So, because when you have, opposing, factions coming together, a lot of times the perspective of the opposite faction is not necessarily true to life, and even that could even be, for countries, for races, or even for something smaller, like if you're within the city and, you keep, you have a group of characters and they're part of like a crafts guild. They're all blacksmiths and they keep talking smack about miners. Later on, introduce miners, you can correct some of that narrative. And, it can lend to some interesting conversations or potential conflicts later on.
Minor smack talk.
Yeah, minor smack talk. Oh, my goodness. Those ones are not trappers.
Hey, now, go easy on the trappers.
But, really, when it comes to novel setting, it should be much easier than developing a role-playing setting. And, however, depending on the length of a campaign, essentially, let's say you create a campaign, you need to really have an understanding of the campaign and what limits the people from progressing outside of that area. You need to know more information. You need to know more background information. But essentially you still need a main quest. What is the quest that the character should be following through in an RPG campaign? Adventure hooks to side quests. They don't necessarily at the beginning need to be fleshed out as well. The thing in a way I start in the same way, where it's like, where is the story starting? And I don't like to really overdevelop too much, but I like to have more for the things that surround it, because characters have a way of zigzagging across a main quest, and the biggest difference is, RPG storytelling is cooperative, where novel storytelling is, only cooperative if you have another author.
Right.
And then, but it's a lot less, you can talk through and work through issues, with the author before the story is released, where it's happening at the time people are engaging with it. It goes back to the story where I had a game master who had one of those gigantic dungeon maps drawn out, which was, and I'm sure is still very popular with game masters. I had a giant map drawn out, and this one was like, I don't know, like 6 or 8 pages, and literally, and it's probably not quite this bad, but it was like the first hallway.
Mm-hmm.
He had it planned for us to turn left, and we all turned right. and we got stuck at a door for hours before he admitted he just had nothing behind it. And we're like, okay, as players, we're just like, all right, we'll go the way you want us to. But the thing is, the thing I like to do is I like to have encounters written up, story threads for characters and for NPCs in the game. So when people do take that deviation, I can just pick something from a list and plop it there and say, okay, this is going to be here. This character now lives in this town, and I have to remember that, or they're visiting that town. But I can take my adventure hooks, my short stories, my side quest, and just plop them in front of the players so that there's something to do when they get there. So, because I do a lot of, I don't really do dungeon runs very often, or they're only a portion of when I run RPGs. So, characters can walk in any direction, and they're limited by the length they can move. You need to know you need to know more to start off with, and a little bit more depth about the things that are around where your story starts, because you're never quite sure how the players are going to react. Another great example was in the actors campaign that I ran. I had this idea where there's a troupe of actors, and they're going to start traveling around and performing, and so to help push it forward, I had a major war going on with a massive army moving up to surround where they were at.
And where they were at was in a gigantic city.
A gigantic city. For those of you who are like D20 players, this is sort of people-wise the size of Waterdeep. It's laid out differently, but it is a huge, massive city, and which would be very hard to siege in general. But the idea was, typically whenever you have an army coming to a town, refugees go. And these guys had a skill that they could have made money wherever they went, but they decided to hunker down instead. So I had to literally use side stories to keep them engaged long enough for me to figure out how I wanted the plot to work in an urban setting rather than a dispersed setting. So, it makes for a lot of fun. And the biggest reason I always push authors to do some gaming, whether it's, even if it's like a narrative heavy system, is if your problem is coming up with stories and adventures, players have a way of making you better at that. It's like practicing improv if you're an actor. You're forced to do a lot of improvisational storytelling to try and move the story ahead without it feeling too forced too, because players don't typically like, when you start beating them over the head and having the dragon go, no, turn left. Okay, now turn right. open the third door on the left, or I'm going to eat you all. And they're like, oh, okay, this is a lot of fun. They don't think that. So you can do that, and sometimes there's a necessity. Like if the group of actors had gone out to engage the army that was coming to Highwall, they all would have died, probably, or they definitely would have lost. So, sometimes you have to use a bit of a heavy hand, but in general, I prefer not to. And it's really good storytelling exercise to tell these interactive stories in games, whether you use like a descriptor system, which is very light on rules, but big on storytelling. Or you can go in and, a classic dice game like D20 or GURPS or whatever you like.
I feel like we have gotten way off the subject. I
know where I am. We just got through adventure hooks. So
I was going to say, because what we were starting with was the 3 important needs for novel setting, and I feel like we just spent a lot of time talking about D&D.
Well, the thing is, after those, there should be a line of text that is just a dot on mine.
Okay,
text got destroyed, and so now we're going into RPG settings.
All right, fair enough. Well, what we covered, just to recap real quick, was details needed for the narrative, details needed for the character's involvement, and enough background information to remember and understand the setting that you're using. And then, are you getting into every GM needs to know?
Oh, really? I'm down to adventure hooks. We just went through. So
adventure hooks. Okay.
Essentially now we're talking about things that you need specifically for RPG settings, and much like a novel setting, the GM needs to understand the area of the campaign or the adventure that you're running.
And by area, you're meaning the
optional.
And by that you're meaning the physical area where it's going to take place, not like the idea like it's a political area that you're going to be dealing with in a story or
and break it down into any chunk that makes sense to you. And it could change over time. So it's like I like to think of the area I'm in and the areas that surround it, have a decent idea about them. Now, then the main quest is optional. You don't necessarily need all of it, and I highly advise against it because much like the adventure hooks, sometimes the players go to a different temple ruin. Maybe you want to move the story there, or insert something to get them to go to a different temple ruin. Which those are your adventure hooks, and then this is where it starts to become really more complicated, because right now, it's probably about the same as a novel setting, maybe a little bit more detail up front. But here's where RPG settings become more difficult. One, you have to convert world elements into a desired system. So unless you're using someone else's story and monsters and races, anything that you have that is not part of the RPG system you're using, you need to understand what all of those things are in that system, so that you can use the system to play it out. And so if you have that magic sword, how does it vary from a plain sword? Dungeons and Dragons always did this the best, it's +2, so it's +2 more chance to hit, +2 more damage. Anything the sword can do, it does +2 more. Maybe the sword makes the head come off a little easier. Whatever it is, you need to understand how your world elements fit not only into the story, but into the actual system you're using. And so the more complicated the system is, the more complicated it is to create the setting. And then everything the player knows, you need to know as well too, especially if it's a world that they're not familiar with. You need to understand what are the elements the players are going to know or should know at the beginning. And there might be specific backgrounds, like they have total amnesia, that they don't know the world settings, but it would be odd for all of the characters. So you need a general, this is what everyone knows. And then with the specific characters, due to their advantages or their background, there might be additional things that characters know. And the big thing to remember here is they don't have to be true. they should all probably be like sprinkled with truth, but the exact truth to what the players know is not necessarily what you as the game master knows. So if they're from the town and they know how to work the street, they might have very good knowledge of a certain area, but not necessarily the outskirts of the town. They might know the docks, but not the merchant district, so it's like, and they might not have a complete understanding. They might think they do, and it might be pretty good or even absolute. That's kind of up to you to choose. But the thing is, you don't only need to know what you know, you need to know what they know. Now, the only thing you don't lie about are equipment and items in their possession. They should know how they interact in the system that you're using. And they might not know everything. I know it was the old Middle Earth system did this, and a lot of RPG games do it now, where you like, say you have a magic weapon, you have that magic sword. Maybe it starts off as a +2 sword, but then over time, the more they use it, the more they become attuned to it. It unlocks new things, and maybe they're not always great, or maybe they are always great. It's up to you, but they need to know what they know at that moment, and it can't be a lie. So you can't say you have a +2 sword and then they hit with it and they take 20 points of damage. They would need to know that up front.
Well, I would suppose with the equipment they start with, right? But if they find something along the way, then they have
that's a new,
okay.
Yeah.
I was going to say, if they have no means to identify it as they go, then sure, because we certainly come across cursed or hexed items.
Yes, and I've known players who like to test out items to see what they are. Always great for girdle checking in old D&D.
Always great for what checking?
Girdle checking.
What is girdle checking?
So there were 2 magic items. And this is old, like 2nd edition Dungeons and Dragons. I'm not sure if they're still around or not. They probably are. There was a girdle of giant strength, and then there was another one of gender swapping. So inevitably, you could throw out a girdle, and people would really want it because it would make them very, very strong. But sometimes, it wasn't what they expect.
Now, was it a permanent change?
Oh, it was a permanent. You have to use something extreme to fix it. It's a cursed item, so I think in theory, if you could get it off, you could fix it. But like in the old D&D, I think the cursed items were
they get adhered to you, so they get stuck on you. Yeah.
You couldn't just take it off.
I remember, like there in. I want to say it was in GURPS where I was looking up cursed items, and the thing that's funny is it's hard to make enchanted items, but making cursed items took very little energy. Yeah. So, like, one of the things that they did was like it was easy to make cursed swords, and you think, oh well, why is that? Why is that? A bad thing? Well, think about it. The guy picks up the sword, now he can't put it down ever. Yeah. This is like he can't eat. He's got to hold a sword all the time.
But it would be interesting, though. It's a great way, it gives you a great way to attack your foes. How can I get some cursed swords into their inventory, to hurt them? Which, gives you potential adventure hooks there too. Even for the main party, it's not always going to be, happiness. Sometimes, you have to throw adversity at them. Not too much that you slaughter them, but enough to make them feel like they're achieving as they're moving forward. And then, so now going back for the RPG setting, everything the GM needs to understand, the main quest and all of the details are optional. The types of settings I think are important. The characters are important, but the exact, room that the confrontation's in, that might vary. Adventure hooks, completely mandatory. Some people call them encounter tables. I don't like using encounter tables randomly. I do have a few that I might pull from a pool of reusable ones, like bandit fights or something like that. But in general, they're more story verse, so they're going to be a lot of times based on the background of characters or of an area that they're new to. And then you have to be able to have all of your world building items. You need to know how they work in the system. And then you need to make sure that there's something created that you can hand out to players so that they understand the world setting. And some of it could be easy. Let's say you're using D20. You're like, elves are from the book, dwarfs are from the book, if you're doing it that way. Or if they have different backgrounds, different cultures, you have to do the cultural stuff, but maybe the statistics are all the same as in the book. And then you also have to be a little cautious there that you don't create an overpowered, template, as I like to call them. That's what GURPS call them, because a template would be a list of all the things everyone in the race had. And so the characters could purchase templates to be a race. Dungeons and Dragons, I don't know they are today, but you used to have to, you just pick a race. So, if the races weren't super balanced, you might say these races aren't playable, but these races are playable. But if you create, especially new races, they have to be balanced so everyone just doesn't become the new race, unless you want them to be. And then you just say you have to play this race.
This is an orc campaign, or this is an elf campaign.
Exactly. And usually the best way to look is kind of look at the modifiers of the races in the book and try and play within those bounds if you don't have any experience doing it. Now, optional, there's some more things that are good. You might have add-ons to the base system. GURPS is great at this because they have the universal system, and then you could buy like GURPS Voodoo, or you could buy their source material, which would give you more items or more magic or different types of magic. And so you could take, you might have things that are completely unique that aren't part of the original system, but you need to extend the way magic works, or you need to restrict the way magic works. You need to know, if you have those things, you need to know what those rules are up front too.
I'm a big proponent of always remembering that the books are called guidebooks.
Yes.
So like if you need to change something, if you need to modify to fit the setting you're creating, the world you're developing, there's like, well, the magic system works okay, but we've got this other thing in magic where, they get it from the strength of the souls of their elders who've passed on. It's like, then you modify it, just change it a little bit, create your own thing, or just like, change what's there. It doesn't have to, you don't have to eliminate it, but sometimes you have to. Sometimes the system that's already in place is just too different than what you want to do. Yeah.
And then the final optional one here for RPG settings, I like to call subtractions. So you have add-ons and subtractions. Maybe call them additions and subtractions would maybe make more sense. But
so what I just said actually kind of preempted your thing. I didn't realize. I didn't see that. Again, guilty of not reading the show notes.
Subtractions are essentially the idea, and this is really important if someone else might use your system, and Michael was kind of getting into it, but it's something you might want to build into yours. You might not want to know every town, and it's okay not to. It's like if you understand the people in the area, maybe a town becomes an entire adventure hook. So they go to a town that's on the map, and instead of putting villagers there, you decide to put orc raiders there, and the village is burned, and maybe there's some loot that they can find that you're not quite sure of, and you're kind of guessing at, but you're filling in those kind of details as they're getting there. But if you know they're going there and you have time between the sessions, prep it out. Even if it's just going to be a random encounter, so you kind of have an idea of what kind of loot will be there. Is there going to be any clues for the main story that you're going to want to try and slip in there? But have subtractions, but this is even bigger if you make it available for other people to use, even if it's just like a free thing on a blog. If you have, especially if you do that, have areas that are unexplained, where someone who takes it can make it into theirs. And now additional points of interest for the GM, obviously fill them out. If, much like for novel writers, if there's something that you're just really intrigued by and you want to know more about, you should always, those points of interest help hook your mind into it as a game master or a novel writer. So if you're really intrigued about a monument in the square of the city, go into more detail, give some history to it, flesh it out like a little character, maybe even an important character. Just follow those points of interest you have as a game master or an author, because those are the things that will give you interesting details that you can mix into the story as you desire. And remember, the last and the most difficult thing when creating a game setting is testing is never optional. And so if you're playing, do it, just going straight to a campaign with players, realize that you might have to make some adjustments, and just warn them up front, okay, I don't think this race is crazy, but it might need to be balanced out as we go along. And then if you have to balance stuff against them, give them something in their favor so they don't feel quite so screwed. But realize that anything that you put into the system might have to be adjusted balance-wise as you're using it. So just keep that in mind whenever you're doing an RPG setting, and especially if it's something that you plan to share out to people. Always make sure to have at least run one campaign in there first, so you know that it works. And you can make tweaks as you need. Maybe you need some more adventure hooks you didn't think of enough or whatever. I like Excel for that. You can just have a nice little list of adventure hooks that you can pull out of. But just go ahead and be ready to make tweaks, especially the first time you use it. And anytime you run it as a game master, it will be different. Mm-hmm. I've actually used adventure hooks in multiple stories or in multiple campaigns, and they look different. Sometimes there's different NPCs involved, but it's usually just because of the way the characters in that story attack it. Now, it wouldn't be very good if it's the same players and that was from your previous campaign. If it's bigger, more epic side quest adventure hook, it's more difficult to do that, but you still can. You just have to change some of the details to make it work in. The most famous one for my campaigns, which none of you've heard of unless you've played, was this. I had this fake cult, and they were a goblin death cult. And so I had it played out in one campaign where it was completely bogus, and there was nothing to it, but the cultists were killing people. So the players ended up interceding and fighting and killing it. And another one, they thought that they were correct because all of the signs were happening, but it happened to be my alien ant overlords that were feeding into a delusion. And I don't even know if the players ever engaged the cult directly. And because of the war, it wasn't quite the necessity. So the story filled in differently, but it was the same idea twice. But instead of killing it in the second one, they were feeding people to the ant zombie overlords. I think that's episode 79, if you want to know more about them.
Good episode, that episode 79.
Yeah. It's all been downhill from there. But
we peaked. We peaked at 79.
But we you just want to keep in mind as we get into the world building task here. Settings are all individualized. Always think about what you need and know more than what you need. But especially if it's a novel, you don't need to know much more. And sometimes it hurts you as an author to know the reason why. And I know a lot of people will push back against that. But the problem is if you answer a question when it's not relevant or needed, you're locked into that going forward. So keep that in mind as you're world building, because a lot of times you will lock yourself and create your own problems, which makes it difficult for you to complete your narratives. So don't do that. So even if you have stuff written down, until it's been released, keep it. Remember, it's a draft. So now for the world building task, Michael.
For the world building, for the world building task, I think that you should take some of the things that we've talked about here. The thing that jumps out at me, honestly, is adventure hooks, and work on something. We realize a lot of you might be working on books, not role playing games, but that doesn't mean you can't take some of this stuff and build off of it. So I like the idea of an adventure hook, something where it's pre-planned and the characters or players just have to run into it. They just have to, meet the right seedy fixer in the dark alley, or get the right contact at the bar who can get you in touch with, this person you're trying to accomplish a thing. So
go to that small village in the middle of nowhere where you think that they're all devil worshippers.
Talk to the wizened sage who knows the information you seek.
And really, to me, those are, they're my variations of subplots. So when I create novels, I have planned subplots that go out there. But it's good outside of a work you're coming on to think up side plots. So coming up with adventure hooks never hurt. Unless you have specific needs, don't pull them into a story. Don't name the people involved, but have the flow of what should happen. And then you can take that and apply it if you need another subplot. I need a subplot that does this. Oh, let me go through my library of subplots. Remember, it's all been written before you start writing your first word. So don't think that even if you repeat yourself, if the details are different, it's going to flow differently.
It's also got your perspective, which always makes it original, even if it's not 100% original. Even
if it's not original from yourself. If you've done this type of thing before, play off of it, or, it's when the details change. And when you go through beta readers, or they're if it sticks out as just doing the same thing over and over again, which I'm not saying to do, I'm saying is you can occasionally, it's like salt. You can add it more than once when you're cooking, until you get the right amount of flavor. So, yeah, go ahead, create a bunch of adventure hooks that aren't they're set in your world, but they're not necessarily tied to a story. And then later on, if you're struggling putting your outline together, or you need to flesh it out for a campaign, go ahead and do it. So for the real world task,
that's you.
And this is something I'm seeing a lot, where people want to be involved in, in politics and in helping what they think is helping people around them. And I think that's awesome. Get involved. But the thing is, don't think that if you can reshape the world to act and behave the way you want it to, it will be better. Realize that you only have the context of your life when you make your decisions, and so do other people. So don't think that, being involved means you have to force changes upon people's behavior around you. And sometimes it might seem like it's very common sense. And I'm not to say, like if you have like a family member who's addicted to drugs, you don't try and get them to stop. What I'm saying is you can't shape the world around you. Being involved is using your mouth and your messaging, your words to tell people things. Ultimately, they have to make the choices. Don't try and make choices for other people. I know it sounds odd, but I see this a lot on the left and the right now. And as a person who doesn't like the Democrats or Republicans, I'm very nervous because I feel both sides, are this sort of puritanical strain in them. And it slightly frightens me. So if you're that person, don't force me to behave the way you want me to. I'm probably a pretty good person. You maybe don't know enough details to understand even what I'm doing. You might even just be making an assumption. So realize freedom is not always beautiful because people make bad decisions. So let people make bad decisions and help as you can. Be involved, but don't try and shape the world to behave the way you want it to. It won't work.
The way I like to say, I have a similar such philosophy, mostly when it comes to interacting with people socially, but it fits in your idea here too, is simply that you can't make up a person's mind for them, but you do have great power to influence it.
Yeah.
So
you can lead the horse to water.
Right. You don't have to, beat somebody over the head with a point and tell them they're wrong and try to show them another way, but you can just show them the other way. Mm-hmm. Just speak its virtues and show them, and be the change you want to be, so to speak.
Sometimes you have to win the word discussion, and I don't want to get into specific policies here, but for most of, especially the policies that get very extreme on both sides, the rhetoric being used is the same, the tactics being used are the same. Try and shut down opposition speech and use the courts or the legal system to force people into a behavior you think is correct. And sometimes there's a need for that, but not all of the time. So remember, and I forget who said this, I think it was Judge Napolitano, is, a government strong enough to protect you is a government strong enough to take everything away from you. And I don't know why I'm so political today, but
I was going to say a lot of this is coming out of nowhere.
Yeah. So it comes from me reading social media posts from people. So relax a little bit. If it's a tough, divisive topic, you have to convince people. You just can't wave a magic wand and fix the real world. So unless you know how, please share in the comments.
Right.
So everyone have a great week, and we'll see you next time. Thank you so much for listening to the World Builders Anvil.
We would love it if you would share the World Builders Anvil with 2 of your friends.
And so would they.
If they are unfamiliar with podcasts, then you get to introduce them to the wonderful world of podcasting.
Take them to Stitcher or iTunes, or best of all, just send them to our website, www.gardul.com.
That's GARDUL.com.
Now strike while the mithril's hot.